going to start with the critical thinking, which is actually the most important part or skill that we get from doing research. I just need, according to the rules, to go through the introductory slide. Of course, you are welcome. Switch off your video and please mute your microphone. Write your student number in the chat. And if you have any technical queries, please send them to ctintat@unisa.ac.za. And then please complete the feedback form. I intend asking Bronwyn, who I think works with the feedback forms, what kind of feedback I'm getting and how to improve if there are any problems, because there must be problems. I'm not some kind of angel or wise person, and that's the only way that I can improve and deliver a better service. So I'll be glad if you fill in the feedback form very honestly. Then I want to ask you something else. Some of you have sent me assignments to critically read, but that's obvious. You want me to read it critically. But what I would like to know from you, what are the reasons? Because I think the service offered by the Writing Center to critically read your assignments before you hand them in. And remember, that is not proofreading. That is, I go through the structure and see if your arguments follow the rules of logic. Why is it, I'd like to find out, why is it that so few people actually use that facility? I won't take any remark personally. That's why we do research, not to get personally involved. So I'll really appreciate those of you who actively decide against it to explain why you've done it, because I think that's information that we also need if we want to improve the service provided by the Writing Center. Then if you want to have an assignment critically read, here are the emails: italian@unisa.ac.za, and it should be CC to ctintat@unisa.ac.za. As I've said before, today we are tackling the critical thinking part of research. It's so important that this diagram of what research is about, that we always go back to it. And do you see, critical thinking happens when we move between these parts and we decide where to move because we are thinking critically. And that's why I spoke last time. I spoke about the words that we use in each of these phases to indicate to ourselves and the reader where we are in our argument. But it is our critical thinking and how we approach it that actually strings our sections together and string them together meaningfully, not sinfully, meaningfully. Last week, the theme was redundancy and repetition. Now, if we look at redundancy, that means that I have information that does not add to the argument. And what's important is that you notice what is the underlying problem, because nobody sits down with the idea, I am going to add unnecessary information to my assignment. And the underlying thought process is that there is little or no conceptualization. I'm going to give you quite a shallow example. Remember an example that I kept on repeating was the example of providing food at schools. Now, if you say on Thursday there was a fight on the school grounds, you want to implicate that there's part of the conflict on the school grounds is due to the children being hungry and irritable. Then you say there was a fight on Thursday. On Friday, there was a shouting match in the corner. Then you haven't conceptualized all those things to the concept of conflict, and you are merely adding the one example after the other. And then you often, and especially at the beginning of your academic career, you simply add the one example after the other, but you do not conceptualize, and that is the reason why you simply keep on adding examples and you do not add to the argument itself. Repetition. In literature, repetition is quite a valid technique. In the research process, remember, if we go back to the previous slide, I want to go back. If we go back to that slide, do you see that we go back to the hypothesis? I've spoken about it, that we often go back to our literature review because we are going to use the authority from the literature review to motivate why we follow a certain methodology. So, repetition, the same facts are repeated in research. Say that your research comes to the conclusion that you disagree with an article you've read in your literature review. That's quite valid. But repetition means that you do not realize that there's a difference between using an article to give authority or to motivate your methodology, and the other hand, you don't know that you are now rebutting an argument and you are now using a counter argument. And that's what happens in the repetition. Repetition is when the same information is repeated without any new insight. And the underlying thought process is that you make that mistake because you are lost in the research process. You don't know why you are using the information. And therefore, I want you to concentrate on the underlying thought processes with redundancy and repetition. Now, before I go on to the new work or to the critical thinking. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask up till now about last week's lesson? I never, okay, I must go down, not up. Okay, recording has started. Are there any questions? You will see that I have added 2 articles in the chat, which means that it's not necessary to read them while I'm teaching, but it would be a good idea if you can just glance at them, because I'm going to refer to them during the lecture, because they illustrate 2 techniques that I want to bring to your attention. Now, what I need you to understand is that we have, like we have the hierarchy of needs from Maslow. We have Bloom's taxonomy, which refers, he made a model, and the model has been changed and adapted through the times, but it's still more or less accepted as it had been in the 1950s. To remember is an important skill. As you can see, you can't do any of the others without memorization. But it is also a very basic skill. If you can remember what I've said, it's fine. But if you don't understand it, it doesn't help. And I see it so clearly with my best example is the way that children work with numbers. One of my grandchildren is very good with memorization. Therefore, he appears very clever. And he can actually, 3, he can actually count to 20 in 2 languages. But it doesn't mean he understands it. He knows the little rhyme, 1 + 1 = 2. He knows that in 2 languages. But if you give him 1 apple and 1 pear, and you ask him, how many fruit do you have? He doesn't click it. So do you see that it's not good enough to remember? You need to understand. And if you remember, I spoke about plagiarism, and that if you have been in a if your undergrad studies and your school studies concentrated on memorization, it's one of the reasons why we plagiarize. It's not that memorization is not important, but it's not most important. Then if he develops, and well, you will understand 1 + 1 some or other time, and it's not necessary that he understands it at the moment. But if he is 5 and he can't start applying the numbers, and he doesn't have an intuitive, what's the difference between plus and minus? There is a problem. So first we remember information, then we understand the information, and then we need to be able to apply it. I see the word schedule here under the verbs. It is no good. I can remember the writing center allocated me a number of hours per month. I remember that. I understand it. Those are the hours that I need to fill, and I need to be able to stand an audit of the hours that I claim. But when they ask me for a schedule, I can't work out how many hours per week do I need to work if I want to fulfill my quota. It's no good. I can remember when we did training, the skills that they require from me to work with my students and the skills that I need to convey to the students, and I can't implement them. I can't read the articles and then apply them in my lectures. So do you see, it is a hierarchy of skills. I don't often work with final year undergrads. The ones that I have had to work with, that they are work. It's funny. It's often the communication students that I see in their final year. They are often on this level, and you may be able to analyze by the end of your degree when you graduate, but most courses that I've seen, you move in these three, but that is not critical thinking. I think a good example would be when I have to submit a schedule to the office. At that level, I do not analyze it. I apply the requirements they've given me. If I start analyzing it and evaluating my analysis, then we get into the whole idea of being critical. And critical thinking does not mean that I find fault with everything. It means, and I like the word, you engage with the idea, because that is like an engagement. You've decided that you want to get married to that person, but during the engagement, you start re-evaluating your decision to move in that direction. And that is what we do when we engage with an idea. Part of you want to agree or disagree, but you haven't made up your mind finally. You've not come to a conclusion. And look at the words that we get when we analyze. And you must actually look when you, in your research proposal, you will most probably, some of you will use apply, and that's fine. Because say that you are going to apply a theory, then you move towards evaluation. What is the result of the action that I take? After I've analyzed, can I differentiate? Do I organize better? Can I now compare? And these things will be in your thesis statement. And look at the many words there are. In most of the feedback I've given the students up till now, I ask them to think about their verbs. You can do it in the chat, or you can do it on a piece of paper. But write the sentence which starts, the aim of this research is, choose a verb, we're back at the chat group. I'll appreciate it if you do write it in your chat, because then I can see if you understand what I'm saying at the moment. So if we go back to where in this whole taxonomy will your research be? I read an interesting assignment this week in which the student was going to apply a code of ethics to the behavior of a company. And then he was going to see if he can suggest improvements to the code of conduct. And I thought that I think it's going to be a lot of work, because I think if I look at his plan, he's going to work at least a year on the project. But can you see that he starts on this level and he intends moving to that level? You are very quiet today. Are you again thinking, or sitting in the bed with a new cup of coffee? It's too cold to sit in the garden with pineapple beer. Okay, I see some people have the excuse they're thinking, but that is actually, oh, here I have one. Lizzie, I'm going to minimize your. The aim of this research is to evaluate. Okay, if you have decided to evaluate, are you going to demonstrate? What will be after this action? Can you see that research, we are now actually working on your thesis. Yes, we are actually working on your thesis statement. If you are going to evaluate, what are you going to do with the evaluation? Do you see, now we move to the second verb. If you are going to demonstrate, investigate, that I get the idea. You are moving, investigate in my mind always, I associate it with a kind of analysis, or to indicate relationships. This is an interesting view. Do you see Maintie's view? We start off by collecting data and then going up the pyramid to analyze, interpret, and later give recommendations. I assume Maintie's is in the humanities, because it often works like that in the humanities. Critical reasoning. But let's go back to my Bloom's taxonomy. Can you see that we in the beginning of our research, how important it is, and I will put this on the in the chat as well, the slides. But do you see that you actually have to have this slide and the slide, the model of how research works? Those two, you actually need to have them on a notice board and make sure you know where you are, and then Bloom's taxonomy will tell you what you are doing there. And you will get lost. I still remember that feeling of getting lost. My master's was in, I think, yes, we did something like 8 modules, 8 chapters, and then every chapter was 2 assignments. And I can remember how stuck I felt if I couldn't see and understand why these 2 chapters are, why these 2 assignments make up 1 chapter. So we do get lost on that other one, and then we don't know what to do over here. And that, people, is part of the process. But do you see that if you write to your supervisor about it, or you discuss it with somebody that can help you, that if you have done all this thinking, how much better you will understand any advice we give you. I copied this definition of critical thinking. It is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information. And here we get to the methodology. So here in these lines, in this case it's participles, but we find the verbs, the actions, and here we find the results. What if I've done that? What will be the result? What can I do then? There's here a guide to belief. Now in research, that refers to your point of view after you've done the research, and then the action is the recommendation that you have, because most of you do very practical research. The advantages of critical thinking on a very, very basic level. You don't sound like Donald Trump. If you listen to podcasts or you see video clips of him speaking, he has a very, very restricted vocabulary. And then he uses very vague sentences like, it will disappear. We don't know what it is that will disappear. We need to understand the whole context, that he had this dream that coronavirus would disappear. I think the whole debate around the coronavirus confronts us with what happens in a society where people do not think critically. I have friends whose children are involved in essential services. Both of them are involved in the food supply chain, so they've never been in lockdown. The one son-in-law, not mine, but my friend's son-in-law, is involved with a chain of shops. So, and he is responsible for the quality control. So every day he moves from shop to shop to make sure the fresh vegetables and fruit are in a good condition. No problems, clean, whatever. They have installed a shower in the garage so that when he comes in, he showers in the garage and puts his clothes directly into the washing machine so that he does not bring any viruses or germs into the house. That makes sense to them. But for some other reason, they don't believe that children can be carriers. So a child who goes to that same shop, never mind whether the child can be a carrier, that child's clothes go through the same shop. So do you see, they do not evaluate information. They do not conceptualize. They say the only thing that counts is the age. They do not conceptualize how viruses, and this specific one, how it is spread and why it is contagious. And if you haven't had a WhatsApp that reflects a lack of critical thinking, you're not on a WhatsApp group. And critical thinking does not happen outside and then outside my emotions. If I cannot conceptualize, I cannot see the reason, and then we get a lot of conflict and an unbearable situation becomes even more unbearable. So on the one hand, you are lucky to be doing research now, because I can't remember ever in my life being confronted with such good and bad critical thinking in the public domain. So what are the barriers to critical thinking? The one is that it's easier to teach people to memorize than to think. Then, in many courses, it's easier to mark multiple choice questions, but they're not always well designed. I see a lot of first year modules. And you know, the moment I can answer a multiple choice test without having even a look at the study guide, I don't know whether the study guide is worth the paper it's printed on. So, unfortunately, it's very difficult, and that I know because I've had to design multiple choice questions myself. It's very difficult to design good multiple choice questions. And I think that is a problem at many universities. I don't know where you did your undergrad, but it is based on the content, not necessarily on interaction with students. Because I don't know how you teach thinking without engagement and personal engagement with the students, which means that you can't simply look at an assignment, make a few marks and give a person 60 or 70 or 80%. You need to go through it paragraph by paragraph, and every time not only look for spelling mistakes, but critically look at the logic. And then, of course, time constraints. To get through a degree for both the student and the lecturer, it is we simply do not have enough time to do everything, and so it becomes very difficult. And then, of course, it's very difficult to have an unbiased curriculum. I haven't seen an unbiased curriculum. Our curricula reflect our point of view, the reading matter, the articles. It's very difficult. And then all those things play into it, that we have to learn critical thinking. It does not come naturally. I'm going to go back to the chat. Where is my chat now? Sorry. So are there any questions up till now, or that you have noticed something that is, what do you think about your research up till now? What do you think, in which direction are you moving at the moment? Do you see how, if you are going to analyze, that you must be doing something with the analysis? And if you think back to your undergraduate years, what do you think might be a problem? Remember, we spoke about when we spoke about plagiarism, that we must know which of these aspects part of us. So if I think back about to my training, I think part of it is that I always had, most of the time, had liberal teachers and later on lecturers. So I do not, and I have not been really exposed to intellectual conservatives. So if I do research, I will have to compel myself to read conservative literature as well. Anybody who can see from their undergraduate years something that will prevent them from moving to critical thinking? Okay, let's go back. Oh, here is one of my very honest students. Yes, I did a lot of memorization in my undergraduate. Yes. And I don't know what you studied in your undergraduate, but I know certain modules require memorization. And then it is very difficult to all of a sudden go into critical analysis. And the problem is that you studied biochemistry. I think you will have had a lot to memorize if I simply remember my school chemistry. And it's difficult to move from memorization to critical thinking. And I think that is the problem with quite a few people, that and if you memorize, because remember a student who's merely telling you what you have told him in the study guide. It's easy to mark his paper, it's easy to give him good marks, so it's easy, in inverted commas, for that person to actually become a postgrad, and then it's the problem with the critical thinking. Where are my barriers? Okay, so what is then critical thinking? The first action is that and think about your literature review. Have in your mind one of your articles in front of you. And the first point is that you can identify other people's arguments, their positions, and that has to do with the theoretical framework and the conclusions. The theoretical framework, we spoke about that. And then what logic was followed. And here it's important, you can see, did they go from the general to the specific? So if you go back to Bloom's taxonomy, on the apply level, they knew a theory, then they understood the theory, and now can this theory be applied in this instance? Or if they have done some interviews and they've come to a conclusion that in certain cases, how far can I take that? How far can I generalize that specific instance? Then, if they've come to a conclusion, remember the unit of analysis, that if I have studied the members of a team, I can't make generalizations about teams, because people in groups are not the same as individuals. In the conclusion, remember when we spoke about critical thinking, I said there's a verb, that's what we do, and then we get the result. Are both these addressed in the conclusion. In this case, I want you to think back to your literature review. Most of you must have submitted your literature review already, or it must be very close to completion at the moment. If you think of your literature review, we're going back to the chats now. What do you think would you like to change there? There's a question, how can I improve my critical thinking abilities? Seema, I suppose that's Mr. or Mrs. Seema. There are 4 stages of learning one of the models. On the first level, I am unconsciously incompetent. So when you got your degree, and if you are here, you must have had good marks for your degree. You didn't know about the requirements for critical thinking, so you didn't know what you don't know. So you weren't conscious of it. Then, and that is the stage where you are now. That kind of question is typically of the next phase, where you are consciously incompetent. I know what I can't do. And it's an unpleasant phase, because you know you need to be able to do something, but you know you can't do it. I think for me, it's the most unpleasant phase of learning something new. The next phase, and you will be moving into that phase the moment you start getting your assignments back and you don't do too badly. What's going on with my screen? I hope it doesn't bother you too much. The next phase is, now I am consciously competent. You make notes of the critical thinking processes that apply and that you think applies to your research. And actively, when you go through an article, you think about those processes. And you go back to the verbs, and you go back to the process, and you consciously do the correct thing. The person who explained it to me explained it by using the example of when you learn how to drive. People, there's something wrong with my... I think it's the electricity, because my computer is now on its battery, but it will last for the lecture. Remember when you were started driving, you had to think, now I use the clutch. Now I go from this gear to that gear. And that is the phase that we call consciously competent. And that is your next phase. And then after a while, it becomes natural. And you can have you can drive without thinking. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself and ask for help from the office with my computer. Here we have somebody said that in their undergrad years, they had to write long essay questions. And now all of a sudden you have to write academically and scientifically. And that is definitely a problem. Brian here gives an example that I would really ask you to do. And that is, it's only on my side. Apparently you don't see the problem on my computer. That you should try and explain what you are doing to somebody. He says a 5-year-old. You don't need to go that far back, but try and explain it to somebody else, because as you explain, you hear the gaps in what you are trying to explain, and that brings your level of understanding better. And then you can start thinking in terms of application and moving up with Bloom's taxonomy. Usually there's a question about acknowledge, have sources in my conclusion. It's not very logical, because your conclusion is your own work. You decide what it is. So I will have to see the conclusion to understand exactly what you mean. But remember, the conclusion is your insight into the problem. So that makes it different. You right here, I think, send me your assignment plus your the tutorial letter that has something to do with it, and then I will look at it and explain, because it looks as if there's a very specific problem that you have, and I'll be able to answer you better if I have the paper in front of me. So the next, so when you have an article, a chapter, a book, you identify the people's argument, their position, their theoretical framework, and then you look at the conclusion. The next one, why do we have alternative points of view? I posted an article where they compare with this current coronavirus. They are comparing the chloroquine and remdesivir. And the article is actually a bit about the politics of scientific research. But look at how they, it's a comparison, and then he comes to a conclusion. But look how, especially how the writer, I can't remember who wrote it, how he critiques both Fauci and the Frenchman Rahul, who is doing, yes, Fauci and Rahul, how he critiques their method and say, therefore, it is a bit difficult to compare the results. But I think it's a very good article to introduce you to that kind of reasoning. You must remember that is a formal writing. It is not academic writing, and the article as such has not been peer-reviewed, but I thought it was a good example of how we compare and then come to a conclusion. And when we have alternative points of view, the first thing is you have to understand why there are more than one point of view. If we look at the current debate about whether the economy should open up or not, why are there two views? The one view is based on epidemiology and why we can't sacrifice people. When people go down into a mine, we expect the mine to be a safe place for them to work. But if people work in a shop and they have to go through the danger of being exposed to the coronavirus on their way to work and at work, why doesn't safety count now? So we have the health perspective. On the other hand, people without jobs are hungry, restless, and they die of malnutrition. So there's more than one point of view, because there are more than one way to die. And what we actually have to do at the moment, we have to choose which one will cause the most deaths, if you want. So, and remember right at the beginning, I told you, read the articles concerning your field of expertise. So if you are in biochemistry, you have to read the articles, not only the scientific articles, but biochemistry in medicine, biochemistry in nature conservation, so that you can understand why there would be more than one point of view. And then what is the context? Why do we now all of a sudden have a debate about health versus economy? Last year, this time, we wanted to give people health and work. So what has changed that the debate has changed? What is the context of my research? And often when I get in assignments, especially when we still had the face-to-face meetings, when I start discussing the assignment with the student, the problem would be that the student only knew the context, the problem in the context of his or her work, but not in the wider context. Because it's the wider context that will help you to understand the more than one point of view. Is that context still valid? And we get it especially with ethics. There was a time when it was profit is everything. Those of you who are now in sustainability issues, you will know that profit is still important, but other stakeholders also have a say, not only the shareholders. So often when the context changes, the debate changes, and it's part of your critical thinking to have those, to answer those questions when you evaluate the material in front of you. Balance, weighing up evidence and opposing arguments fairly. Last week there was a question about how do I have unbiased or unprejudiced research. And it was one of those questions that stayed with me through the week. How do I try and have a fair approach to opinions that I do not agree with? And is it even, well, I'm not doing research at the moment, but in private conversations, is it even worth my while to try and change people's opinion? So critical thinking, weighing up evidence and opposing arguments fairly. We have to decide what is fair. Say, for instance, that you are studying the rotation of the earth and wind. So the wind doesn't blow that badly on the equator as it does at the poles. So you think about it and so on. Now, the heat also plays a role in how the wind blows, all those things. What you do not need in that debate. So you look at what causes the wind to blow and you think about it and you try and get all the perspectives. What you don't put in that whole equation is the people who believe the earth is flat. In every discipline, there have been concepts and theories that have been proved wrong. They're in a bin and you don't take them out unless there is a very serious reason to take them out of the bin. So what is fair means that I know my discipline well enough to realize some theories really need to be in the bin. I'm a teacher. I've never had to teach a subject where people simply have to remember things. I've always taught languages, and there we don't teach children to memorize. And enough has been said about memorization that I know that's an important skill, but if that skill doesn't lead to other skills, it's useless and even a dangerous skill. So I can only weigh up evidence if I know enough about my field to know what is actually such outdated evidence and theories that I don't need to consider it. Another one would be the washing of hands. When the guy years ago said, but if you move from one patient to the other, you need to wash your hands properly. He was laughed out of the hospital. That argument has been settled. We wash our hands now before we do shopping, and we wash it afterwards. So what is fair is you have to think carefully in your field what would be fair and which theories and concepts are so settled that they may be part of the discussion and what belongs on the junk heap. And then, and that is, I think it's true for all research, whether you are in the sciences or in the humanities, that you have to think in terms of more than one theoretical framework. One of the least productive heads of department I've ever worked for only looked at any kind of paper according to Bloom's taxonomy. There are other theories and reasons for having an exam paper. Bloom's taxonomy is very clear, but there are other aspects that we need to consider when we, for instance, a paper must have balance. If I spend most of the term on a certain aspect, I can't, it's not fair to the children to spend only 3 marks on that aspect if I've spent most of the term on it. So do you see that you have to consider more than one theoretical framework? The next one is you will have to consider sources that do not support your point of view. On a very basic level, read the newspapers that irritate you. Previously, I could have told you go to a coffee shop and take a magazine which you don't like. Nowadays, that's not possible. But if you have a strong point of view, for instance, I think even in biochemistry, with science, we have a lot of pseudoscience. Even if you don't agree with it, if you only believe in real medicine, medicine that comes from a lab, read something about natural and herbal medicine so that at least you know there is a different point of view. The fourth one that you have is reading between the lines. If somebody has a strong point of view, you can take me as an example. I honestly can't stand Trump. To me, he reminds me of every person I haven't liked. That means I'm biased. I'm not going, when I give you an example, I cherry pick my examples, and cherry pick is a word that's accepted to criticize a theory, and that is when you only take the examples that suit your perspective and your point of view. And especially we see that with the debate around climate change. People only from both sides only take the evidence that supports their point of view. So read between the lines what evidence have been chosen and what have been left out. So first of all, I ask this person, what is his paradigm? What is his worldview? And that is why I have so much respect for Fauci. They asked him about opening of schools, and he said, I know about public health. I do not know about schools. I know about the language of research, but I do not know the content of your research. So what is the worldview? And then, are there assumptions based on solid data or proven theory? A good idea would be to read that article about the chloroquine versus the remdesivir, because there you have the debate between solid data and an unproven theory. And how do we handle that? And what is very important, what is the credibility of the author or the publication? And that is why the university insists that most of your articles must come from peer-reviewed articles. I suppose most of you are in the Western Cape region. When something appears in the Sun, it has less credibility than what is written in other newspapers. Somebody who wrote an assignment about current affairs used the Daily Maverick as a source. And I think he referred to the Scorpio unit working for the Daily Maverick. They're investigative journalists, and they have quite a lot of credibility. But find out your source, your publication. Is that accepted by the rest of the discipline? If you are going to do research about vaccination or the anti-vaxxers, where do the people find their information? If you are not sure about the credibility of the author or the publication, you should contact the library or your supervisor. And then, what persuasive techniques are used? And that's not only in popular literature, it's also in the academic world. Can you see that if you read an article in which they give credibility to somebody who is not credible? I read an article about a scientist. She got a PhD for it. She did research and found that certain medicine, I'm going to call it medicine, it was actually something else, would cause more trouble than any of the advantages. And her research couldn't be replicated in another laboratory. Therefore, the article that she published was retracted, and it became quite a scandal. But what she does, she played on the fear that people, all of us with children, are scared that something we do would harm the children. So even research has a way of persuading people to believe them. Do you remember, I think it was last year or the year before, an article written by students at Stellenbosch caused quite a furore, and the article was also retracted. So look at who wrote it and what kind of worldview is behind the article, and then how does the person try and convince you that his or her conclusions are right. Do they give you a lot of data and a lot of statistics? Then it becomes very difficult, if you're not trained in statistics, to see the glaring errors in their remarks. I've actually kind of the unit of analysis. To me, I know the words, whatever, but this year when I discussed it with you, I all of a sudden realized how often do people fool around with the unit of analysis. So what persuasive techniques are used? Another one is to take an anecdote and to generalize from that. And people do that with case studies. They take a case study and analyze that. But if you take a case study and you analyze it, the generalization can only be done in a very specific context. Now, the very structure of, I think it's time to go back. Where is my... Do you have any questions? Because I keep on speaking and you guys must now more or less be exhausted. Do you have any questions about what I've said up till now, or anything that you want to add to it? What I want you to notice at this time, and what should be upmost in your mind, is that when I start, and remember, the critical thinking must also be applied to your own reading. You also have to look at the influence of your paradigm, of your life view, and your context. How does that influence your writing, the examples that you look for, the methodology that you are going to choose? Critical thinking has a structure and it synthesizes ideas. You will see that part of the articles I posted for you, the one is, I don't know whether you know the concept of mathematical models. It's very much in the news currently with the coronavirus, where they try and predict how many people will die and even when. Have you heard that they say that in September it will be very bad in South Africa? And that is part of a model. Where you can see models worked, synthesis, where they took mathematics and they used the data from weather. And now we get weather predictions per hour. When I get up in the morning and I have to decide what I'm going to wear. And I know I teach at 12. So I choose my clothes according to the weather by the time I am going to wear those clothes. And that's a very good example where they took mathematics and they took a lot of data from weather stations all over the world, and now they can predict weather quite well. Now, what this person has done here, they said that if we take events from the past, if we take history, we ought to be able to predict certain events in the future because there are cycles and so on. And I posted that article because I think it's a very good example of we take the student with the chemistry might understood the picture better than I do, but it's simply you take a part, you take another part, and with that you make something that's totally new. And the article as such, I think the article is published, and she's the person who wrote the article. She is a historian interested in the history of science. And I think the article is getting ready for publication. And by publishing it in that magazine, she's waiting for remarks to kind of finish off the article before it becomes an academic article. But I thought it was one of the best ideas where we synthesize, we bring together totally different ideas. I mean, the people who take history are usually not the people sitting in the maths class. And she managed to get two widely different fields and combine them. So, how do you evaluate the ideas or concepts? And remember, I said to you right at the beginning how important it is to conceptualize. So a war usually has a beginning, the day it was declared, and the day the peace accord was signed. So you have this and that, you have specific, but before the time you have all kinds of skirmishes, and afterwards you have all kinds of skirmishes. So how do you conceptualize the whole idea of war? And how do you evaluate them? And how do you know which should go where? To my mind, synthesis is one of the most difficult skills in critical thinking. Maybe because I don't think I can do it, but it is an interesting skill. And then after you have evaluated the ideas and the concepts, you have to decide what is now your position on the issue. And that then is often in your conclusion with your recommendation. So what is the conclusion? Critical thinking engages with the issue. And I don't know how you guys, your generation and more younger than I am, But then nowadays, engagement was quite a serious commitment. And if there was a big fight during the engagement, you often got cold feet. People like me should have had cold feet, but that's not important. But engages means that you really wrestle with the issue and see if somebody disagrees with me, why? And in that case, you go into the mode, as Stephen Covey has said, to understand rather than to be understood. Because once you can understand why somebody disagrees with you, you may also understand your own point of view better. And then the most important thing, critical thinking produces a coherent argument, which means it begins with clear insight into the problem, and it moves from that original verb, which is my main verb. It moves to another verb, which is then my result. And because the first line is a clear line, all the other ideas are strung together so that it becomes a coherent argument. I'm going back, I don't know whether it flickers on your side as well, but when I go onto the screen, oh, it doesn't flicker at the moment. Here, Mr. or Mrs. Maintjies has an interesting one. If you look at different news channels, they use different methods to give information. One channel will use interviews and opinions, and other uses data and graphs. And do you see that if in both cases, they leave themselves open to cherry picking? Because it's very easy to manipulate a graph. And it's the same with if you have a discussion, you invite people to the discussion. So you choose whose views will be heard. I smiled at myself on Sunday. They had one of these discussion programs on the radio, and it's easier for me to listen to the radio while I tidy my kitchen. And when they said that this one politician was going to speak, I decided I'd rather listen to music, otherwise my whole Sunday mood will be upset. So what I want to say, it's very difficult to do fair research because you really have to engage with ideas that you do not necessarily either believe or support. Are there any questions about the critical thinking? I see somebody said here where I asked a question about what the first and the second verb. She said, explore what is. I suppose you are going to work with a grounded theory, Ms. Barnard, and what can be an advanced application. So you are going to move towards some kind of recommendation after you have this covered some themes, or you are going to, because to my mind there's a difference between exploring and analyzing. So Ms. Barnard, just make sure that you and the person, the brain person, also explore and analyze, have in common, but there are also differences and nuances. So what I want you to do is make sure you know what you are doing. Are you now all of you going to become very critical thinkers? Listen, guys, I have 1 minute left. I just want to say that I don't know in your communities, but in my communities and we are tired of the lockdown, and we are worried about, I am worried about my future and how I'm going to look after myself. And I suppose it's the same for all of you. And when we are under pressure, it becomes very difficult to focus. So be kind to yourself so that you will have the energy left. You are really investing in your studies at the moment. It's not easy to sit down for an hour and listen to somebody. You are really investing in your studies at the moment, and you still have to invest in your careers, those of you who work from home. And you have to invest in relationships with friends and families. Be kind to yourself and ask for help if you need it. When we were a face-to-face campus, we had counselors. I can't think that those counselors are not working. But if you need help, go and find it. It's part of critical thinking to look at yourself and say, now I need help. Please be careful and stay safe. And then I see you next week for the data collection. Oh, there was a question about Bloom's taxonomy. Yes, somebody asked me about Bloom's taxonomy and how research works. All that I've told you, I will put on the files, and I will also remember last time I promised you a list of the words, and I'll also upload that to the file section so that you can find it there. Okay. Be good and look after yourself. Date and time, the next lesson. It's usually on a Wednesday, 12 to 2. Okay. Good luck, people.